On the broadcast tonight, Korea will scrap rice import caps starting next year, opening its market for the staple grain to foreign competition for the very first time. The ramifications and opposition? We'll find out. A Malaysian airliner crashes in eastern Ukraine, killing all 298 people on board. The U.S. believes a surface-to-air missile shot down the passenger jet. And North Korea threatens to review its decision to enter the upcoming Asian Games in South Korea, a day after talks over their participation break down. Early edition begins now.
I see trees of green, red
늘 남편 먼저,
I see them
늘 자식 먼저.
for me and
레이디 퍼스트라는 말을 믿고 살아온 당신. 오늘만큼은 세상 누구보다 당신이 먼저입니다. 한 분 한 분 특별하게 모시겠습니다.
Excellence in Flight, Korean Air.
It is 5 a.m. in New York, 12 noon in Kiev, and 6 p.m. on Friday, the 18th of July here. Live from Seoul, I'm Moon Gon-young.
And I'm Daniel Chen. Thank you for joining us. We begin with a very tragic story developing. A Malaysia Airlines passenger plane carrying nearly 300 people is shut down over eastern Ukraine, killing everyone on board.
Well, pro-Russian separatists are suspected in the incident, although there are far more questions than answers right now. First, here's our Shin Se-min.
A Malaysia Airlines aircraft bound for Kuala Lumpur from Amsterdam was shot down near Ukraine's border with Russia on Thursday, killing all 298 people on board. U.S. intelligence officials have confirmed that a ground-to-air missile brought down the plane, although it's still not clear who fired it.
With respect to the Malaysia Airlines disaster today in Ukraine, I'm closely monitoring the reports. There is a clear need, a full and transparent international investigation. For the moment, I offer my deep condolences to the families and loved ones of the victims and people of Malaysia.
Ukraine's intelligence agency has since released audio of a purported telephone conversation between pro-Russian separatists in the east of Ukraine. They are heard talking about the downed jet and seemed confused about the presence of a passenger plane in the airspace above them. The tape has not been independently verified, but it has added credence to suspicions that rebel forces are to blame.
We do not exclude the possibility that this plane was also shot down and stress that Ukrainian armed forces did not perform any actions to fire at targets in the air.
In this regard, I want to emphasize that this tragedy would not have happened if there were peace on that land, and in any case, if the military activities had not resumed in the southeast of Ukraine.
More than half of the passengers on Flight 17 were Dutch nationals. The identities of 41 passengers have yet to be verified. Shin Se-min, Arirang News.
Now, if you remember, the tragedy of Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 follows another air disaster just 4 months ago involving the same company, the same type of commercial jetliner, which is a Boeing 777, and the same airport in Kuala Lumpur.
That's right, that was Flight 370, which vanished from radar in March. It remains missing to this day, with more questions than answers about its ultimate fate. And now, the downing of Flight 17 with nearly 300 people on board.
You know, it's what experts are calling a pair of disasters that are without precedent in modern civil aviation history. But Koreans remember another from more than 30 years ago that is eerily reminiscent.
Mystery still surrounds Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 that went missing back in March, with still no sign of any wreckage or the 239 people who were on board. The Boeing jetliner en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing is believed to have crashed somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Despite massive international search efforts, the accident still remains unsolved, and investigators appear no closer to determining what happened to the plane than they were 4 months ago. And now another tragedy involving a Malaysia Airlines flight, this one shot down, killing everyone on board. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak says the attack was a shock and ordered an immediate investigation. In the span of less than 5 months, some 530 people have been killed while flying on Malaysia Airlines planes. It puts the future of the company in question. The crisis also brings to mind a similar attack from 3 decades earlier. In September 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 bound for Seoul from New York was shot down by a Soviet fighter plane, killing all 269 people on board. The attack came during the peak of the Cold War and further heightened tensions between the West and the Soviet Union. The Korean airliner was shot down after being mistaken as a reconnaissance plane. The downing of the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 and the deaths of nearly 300 innocent lives appears to also be the result of tensions between states. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Now, shifting our focus, another setback in inter-Korean relations, and it came in the form of the North Korean delegation storming out of the room. We're talking about how Thursday's working-level talks intended to discuss the details of North Korea's participation in the upcoming Asian Games in South Korea came to an end. And on this Friday, the North is accusing the South of acting in bad faith. Our Unification Ministry correspondent, Hwang Sang-hee.
North Korea threatened Friday to reconsider its decision to participate in the upcoming Incheon Asian Games, pinning the failure of Thursday's working-level talks squarely on the South. Through its state-run Korean Central News Agency Friday, the North criticized the South Korean delegation for what it called an insincere attitude in the latter half of the meeting, claiming it came under the directive of the presidential office of Cheongwade. It accused the South of taking issue with the number of North Korean cheerleaders and the size of the North Korean flag that would be used during the Games. Should Seoul maintain such a stance, Pyongyang threatened to reconsider its plans to participate in the sporting event. South Korea's Unification Ministry expressed deep regrets about North Korea's angry outburst and called for Pyongyang to return to talks with sincerity. The two Koreas met at the border village of Panmunjom on Thursday to discuss the details of the 700 North Korean athletes and cheerleaders that were planning to make the trip south for the Incheon Asian Games, which begin in September. But when South Korea asked for more details on its plans and said it would accommodate the North Korean delegation just as it would any other team that's participating in the Games, North Korea walked away, questioning Seoul's motives. The two sides have not set a date for their next meeting. While some experts had hoped the Asian Games could become a platform for improved inter-Korean ties, Thursday's meeting shows that the two sides still remain far apart. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
Well, the United Nations Security Council has denounced North Korea's recent series of short-range ballistic missile tests. Officials say just the fact that the Security Council has even addressed this issue shows how seriously the global community views this situation. Here's our Choi Yu-sun.
Following a closed-door meeting on Thursday, the United Nations Security Council called on North Korea to stop its recent series of short-range ballistic missile tests.
The members of the Security Council condemned these launches as violations of Security Council resolutions 1718 in 2006, 1874, 2009, 2087, 2013, and 2094, 2013, and urged the DPRK to fully comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions.
The Council's condemnation comes after Pyongyang launched 3 rounds of Scud short-range ballistic missiles between June 29th and July 13th toward the East Sea of the Korean Peninsula. For conducting 3 nuclear tests and repeatedly testing its short to long-range ballistic missiles since 2006, North Korea has been banned by the UN from any type of ballistic missile or nuclear-related activity. The Council had previously released a statement denouncing the North's medium-range Nodong missile launch in March. South Korean officials say it's very unusual for the Security Council to discuss the regime's short-range missile testing.
It's meaningful that the Council and not the North Korea Sanctions Committee discussed the issue after recognizing that the frequent short-range missiles on the Korean peninsula were threatening international peace and security.
Pyongyang is expected to protest the latest statement out of the United Nations. In response to the statement in March, North Korea threatened to carry out what it called a new form of nuclear test. Choi Yu-sun, Arirang News.
Moving on to other stories, the Korean government has announced it will liberalize the nation's rice market starting next year. It was a decision that came after much deliberation and has been met with fierce resistance from farmers' unions within the country. Our Hwang Ji-hye has more details on this story.
Korea will open its rice market next year. Agriculture Minister Lee Dong-pil said Friday that it's simply too costly to import more rice, which was the trade-off for postponing rice market liberalization. Korea promised to open up its rice market under a 1994 agreement with the World Trade Organization, but because rice is a Korean staple food, the country was allowed to push back the date for 20 years in exchange for gradually raising its rice import quota. That extension is set to expire at the end of this year.
The import quota of over 400,000 tons this year, which makes up 9% of the nation's total rice consumption based on 2013, is a heavy burden on the nation's overall rice market, especially when rice consumption continues to drop in Korea.
While the government says it will protect the domestic market by imposing high tariffs on foreign rice, it did not provide specific numbers. Pundits are expecting the tariff rate to fall at around 400%. They say that level of tariff would ensure that Korean rice maintains its price competitiveness against Chinese or American rice, which can cost half the price or even less. The government also laid out plans to support the nation's rice industry through an insurance program meant to stabilize rural household incomes. Korean farmers, however, on Friday continued a massive protest that began the day before. They said they intended to protect the nation's food sovereignty that the government seems to have handed away.
The government is leaving our jar of rice to the US and China or other countries rich in grain. This will never guarantee the food security of Koreans.
The government plans to set the nation's tariff rate on rice and have it verified by the WTO by this September. It said it will work hard to gain full understanding from local farmers about the change. Hwang Ji-hye, Arirang News.
South Korea and China are making slow but steady progress in bilateral free trade talks. On certain issues, the two sides are seeing eye to eye, while on others, they remain far apart. Our Song Ji-san has more on Seoul and Beijing's 12th round of negotiations.
South Korea and China have been working to draw up a free trade deal for more than 2 years now, and the two sides are drawing closer to an agreement.
We have made notable progress in this round of negotiations. We have reached an agreement in principle on market liberalization in the service and investment sectors.
The two sides agreed to start with a positive list approach, in which they will list items and areas to be liberalized, and then switch to a negative list approach within a certain period of time. In a negative list agreement, all items and services are liberalized with the exception of those named. It represents the first time Beijing has agreed to this approach. As for products and sensitive agriculture industry, the two sides are still narrowing differences, but Seoul is firm that it won't allow cheaper Chinese products to take hold of the domestic market.
When we moved into the second stage of the FTA talks, we were sure that we could protect our agricultural sector by including the majority of our products in the extremely sensitive list. China, on the other hand, wants steel and machineries included in the list.
The two sides were eager to make progress at these negotiations, the first since Presidents Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping agreed in summit talks early this month to finalize a bilateral trade pact by the end of this year. The next round of negotiations is set for September in China. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News, Sejong.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life. talking with you on air and online, connecting you with experts on the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best with Moon Gong-yong and Daniel Che on Early Edition at 6.
The United Nations Human Rights Committee has lambasted Japan for not taking more responsibility for its past atrocities.
Well, the committee, during its regular two-day review of Japan's human rights situation, said the Japanese government hadn't gone far enough in apologizing for its sexual enslavement of women before and during World War II.
Right, and the UN committee also said that the female victims should be called enforced sex slaves instead of using what it called the rather vague term of comfort women.
And the recommendation, analysts say, implies that the committee acknowledges the need for a clearer term for the victims to show that they were forced into wartime brothels by the Japanese military.
Now, on to another news. North Korea is entering into a contract with an international organization, and no, not as a violator of another UN resolution, but as a member that vows to combat money laundering and terror-related financing.
Hard to believe, but the Asia-Pacific Group on Money Laundering, or APG, approved Pyongyang's application to be an observer on Thursday. The North has agreed to abide by the entry conditions, but will be under close observation for 3 years to see if it follows its commitments.
And if it does, it will then be eligible for full membership. And, some have questioned, like you, Daniel, the North intentions about joining the organization. But this is an establishment for back in 1997, and the APG consists of 41 member nations. So we'll have to wait and find out how well North Korea will carry out the observer role. But now let's get a recap of the week's domestic headlines.
Let's do that with our Yulian, who joins us.
Good evening. Let's first take a look at a special series by the Joseon-ilbo, which interviewed renowned experts on Northeast Asia. Now, the purpose was to talk about the changing political dynamics in the region, particularly with the United States trying to increase its presence here. Now, you see here Jonathan Pollock, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution that specializes in East Asian international politics. Now, he says the United States is more concerned about South Korea's damaged relationship rather than with South Korea's growing relationship with China. The summit talks between Korea and China earlier this month show that the countries are edging closer together, which Pollock says is good news for the United States as it will add stability to the region. Now, he goes on to say that the deterioration of ties between Korea and Japan is of a greater concern as it poses a serious threat to the U.S., South Korea, Japan trilateral alliance. But while South Korea and Japan are drawing apart, North Korea and Japan are drawing closer. Now, here you see Kent Calder, who is the director of the Edwin O. Reischauer Center for East Asian Studies, and he says the improved ties are only temporary and meant to act as a counterbalance to stronger ties between Seoul and Beijing. Calder says there is a limit to how much closer Tokyo and Pyongyang can get. And as for Japan's larger military role in the region, Calder says that's not much of a concern. Japan's powers are overestimated, he says, as it has a rapidly aging population, which means a lot of government funds will need to be channeled there. Now, moving on over to Joseon-ilbo, the headline here reads, "Any good ideas or brilliant ideas, we will give you 4% of total sales." Now, this is what LG Electronics, Korea's second largest consumer electronics company, says it began doing earlier this week. The idea is pretty much similar to what crowdsourcing websites like the US-based company Quirky do, where they take ideas from people and bring them into the market. Now, here, the paper shows the process. Now, an idea gets proposed, and when it passes through 3 qualification rounds, which include consumer testing and evaluations by LG Electronics, the idea is finally made into a product. Now, and it's not just the inventor that gets 4% of the sales, but also anyone who took part in the product development. Now, finally, moving on over to 동아일보 over here, and the headline here reads, Mobile World Cup. Now, the story shows in numbers how Koreans are shifting away from PCs and TVs and toward mobile phones when viewing major sporting events. The image here compares the percentage of those that watched the Olympics in 2012 and this year's World Cup on televisions, the mobile internet, and on their computers using their internet. Now, while the number of those that watch the major sporting events dropped for TVs and PCs, the percentage of those that use mobile internet actually rose from 18% for the Olympics 2 years ago to nearly 59% for the World Cup this year. Now, that does it for this week's look at some of the eye-catching stories from the local papers.
Well, thank you very much, Leanne, for that. But speaking of electronic gadgets, the global smart home and not smartphone, smart home market is forecast to double over the next 5 years. Now, Daniel, do you know what a smart home is?
I know we are moving on from the word ubiquitous, which has been everywhere, and then the Internet of Things, to the fact that it's going to be very convenient for us and we won't have to worry about a thing once we leave our homes in the near future.
Right. So, you know, if you're wondering outside of your home, did I leave my, electricity on, my light on? Did I remember to turn off my coffee maker? You know, those things, you can quiet those worries by this smart home system where you just take a look at your tablet PC or a smartphone, and you can, in fact, remote control the entire house. And this, in fact, used to be what was believed to be only for the tech savvy and the wealthy, right?
Right, but we have market research firms like Strategy Analytics saying that the 26% of broadband households in the world will have at least one smart home system by 2019. And it also says revenues in the U.S. will account for nearly 40% of the global total in 2014, with more than 20 million households spending billions of dollars on smart home systems. But enough about the numbers. Tell me about something else about the smart home future.
Right. Well, this research firm says that the smart home industry is set to become a major market opportunity for technology and service providers over the next 5 years. So maybe you could consider getting yourself a smart home.
I don't think we will have a choice in the future.
All right. Well, let's move on to another story. Many of our viewers will have heard of Pororo or larva. Have you?
I did, but if you haven't, I don't believe you. And if you didn't, well, you will soon. As Korea's most popular animated cartoon characters, they are winning over countless young fans around the world. And they are taking home plenty of awards to boot.
And, riding on this wave, Korea has pulled out all the stops for its largest character fair, which is currently underway in southern Seoul, and our Park Ji-won was there.
This adorable feline character is one of the most popular emoticons on Korea's mobile messaging application KakaoTalk. It's been downloaded more than 1 million times since it was first introduced in 2012. If cats aren't your thing, how about a sleep-loving sloth? This sloth character embodies the slow life that some of us might miss in this busy modern society we live in. And we'd be remiss if we didn't mention Pororo, perhaps the most widely recognizable Korean character worldwide. The children's animation has been exported to some 130 countries since it debuted in the early 2000s. Following in the lovable penguin's tracks is Larva, another successful character that now has a presence in 105 countries.
It doesn't have any language, it doesn't have any dialogue. It's a simple slapstick comedy that everybody easy to understand, so I think that's the main reason.
From instant messenger emoticons to healing icons, Korea's character industry is expanding rapidly. In just 6 years, the export volume of Korean characters has more than doubled, and from 2010 to 2012, the export volume grew at an average growth rate over 22% every year.
Well, I've been visiting Korea since the early 1990s in the licensing business. I've really seen the industry grow and become a very mature, and it's really grown to world-class level. Particularly with a lot of the innovative properties.
I think there's definitely a maturing of the licensing market here. People are more aware of the value of an effective strategic licensing program, how it could help create more awareness for their brand or their character, and how it could also help them create a significant revenue stream.
All these characters and many others can be found at the Seoul Character and Licensing Fair being held at COEX through this Sunday. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Well, finally, it rained last night, and it has brought on milder temperatures today.
Welcome news, and let's hope it stays nice and cool this weekend as well. Let's find out if it will be turning out that way. Our Michelle Bach joins us for the weather. Michelle?
Good evening. Today was relatively cool across the nation despite it being Chobok, which is supposed to be one of the hottest days of the year. And it will be hotter tomorrow when temperatures will rise to the 30s in some regions. Now, rain is also in the forecast for some areas, including in the central region, while both Chungcheong-do provinces will have rain on Sunday. Now, going over to our tomorrow's readings, Seoul will start off the Saturday morning at 23 and reach up to 29 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will peak up to 33 and 30 degrees. Now moving over to other regions, Jeju Island tops to 29, Dokdo hits 27, while Mangkeungang tops out at 30. Now that's all for now. Michelle Park, and back to you guys.
Thanks, Michelle. And that brings us to the end of our newscast for this week. Thank you for watching.
And we'll see you right back here Monday evening. Bye-bye.